Hello, I am now going to take you through how to answer all the questions on the Elizabeth paper, but really I'm going to focus on questions 1, 2 and 3 because question 4, the historic environment one, really requires a separate bit of instruction for reasons we'll come to. So I'm mainly going to focus on the 3 other 8-mark questions all in one go. If you want to find out more about how to answer each of these questions, I go into a little bit more detail in the videos below, so do have a look if you want to. Just some basic things. Obviously, read the questions carefully. Remember, the command at the beginning is always the same, but the focus at the end changes. So underline that. Make sure you know what you're looking for. Keep a close eye on time. There are 4 questions in this paper. If it's 8 marks, it's worth 10 minutes, but the essay question, you want to be spending longer on, about 20 minutes. Make sure you annotate, particularly for the first question, which is the interpretations question. You know, underline the things you want to talk about. You should be prepared for Q4, and therefore it might well be worthwhile doing that if you are feeling confident about it, because you should have, well, you'll certainly have some idea of what it's about, and you should be quite well prepared, hopefully, to have some sense of what it is that you actually have to answer. Obviously, reading through is really important, and write something for everything. Never leave a blank space, because writing something is better than nothing. You might pick up a mark here or there. So let's look at question 1. Question 1 is an interpretation question, which means it's about a piece of text or a point of view about the past. So it'll always say, study the interpretation. How convincing is it? In other words, how much do you believe it about something? In this case, it's about Queen Elizabeth and marriage, so we'll use that as the example. So what you're doing then is you're going to spend about 10 minutes, a little bit longer is fine, but not too much because it's an 8-marker. And what you're doing is in this question, you're going to have to look for what this source says about Elizabeth and marriage, whatever the focus is. And you want to try to find 2 to 3 things, you might find 4, that it tells you, and you're going to pick up marks by finding those things. But to get higher marks, you then need to link those things to your knowledge and explain why those things are true or not true. Now, in this case, for example, you might say one of the things it tells you about marriage is Catholic suitors ruled them out, and then you would use your knowledge to say why that is true, because she was a Protestant trying to establish a Protestant church. A Catholic suitor might have disagreed with her on that and made that much more complicated for her, etc. There is also the possibility sometimes of pointing things out which you might not agree with, but you don't have to do that. In this case, it says that she had a deep-seated, it's unlikely she had a deep-seated dislike of marriage, and you might say, well, that's not really true. She'd always said that she didn't want to get married. The experience of her father and his treatment of women would have put her off, so you can disagree. You could also point out something that isn't in there that you think is really important, but I would focus on the source. That's what you need to do, the interpretation. What is it telling you, and how can you explain whether that's true or not? The best answers will then say, overall, how convincing is this? Or is it convincing to a certain extent, but maybe not in another? Don't refer to the provenance, which is the bit at the top, because it is not important. So you can cross that out. That's purely there for copyright reasons. So the second question is always going to ask you to explain something. Once again, it's an 8-mark, so it should take you about 10 minutes, there or thereabouts. Now, you're going to be asked to explain the importance of something. It will either be an event, a person, or a feature of Elizabethan life. It's going to basically be asking you to explain the significance of a cause of something or a consequence. So if you keep those things in mind, you won't be surprised at what you get. Now, in this case, the one you can see is about consequences, because if you look at it, it says explain what was important about the arrival of Mary Queen of Scots. In other words, what was important once she'd arrived? What were the consequences of her arrival in 1568? Now, the process for this is you want to try to explain 2 significant causes or consequences using that point evidence explain model, which you know all about. Now, you can see my little model on the left there. It's worth pausing and having a look, because you can see how I've structured it. I haven't written the whole answer, but you can see that there's a 3-paragraph structure there, isn't there? So I've said one of the ways in which her arrival was important was it inspired Catholic rebels, and then I've gone on to explain why that was significant. Second paragraph, do break up into paragraph, makes it easier for the examiner. Another reason it was important was it gave Elizabeth a dilemma. She had to decide how to treat her. And then what I've done, the really, really important thing for those trying to get the highest marks is overall I've given some sense of how significant this event was. So it's a judgment, okay? Now, when you're thinking about importance, it might mean how it affected people's lives or the impact it had on the Queen itself, for example. Think about what changed as a result, okay? And as I've said there, the best answers provide some sort of judgment as well. Third question, no surprise again, if it's worth 8 marks, it's about 10 minutes, give or take. You can have a little bit longer, but not too much more. Again, the command is always the same. This time it's write an account, but remember, always underline the last bit of the question because that's where the focus is. So in this case, it says write an account of the ways in which the voyages of discovery affected Elizabethan England. So this question is going to ask you to describe and explain how and why something changed in Elizabethan England, okay? Now, ideally, what it's asking you to do is give some sort of chronological, in other words, date-ordered account of the change and explaining what happened at each point. Now, I'll be honest, my experience of this suggests that people find that quite tricky because it does involve remembering a lot of dates. So in this case, if you can remember how the voyages of discovery sort of take place chronologically, brilliant. If you can't, and that is understandable because it is quite tricky to do that, then what I would suggest is you try to think about what changes happened and you just write about those changes. And in fact, that's the model I've given you there, which I think is a slightly simpler way to do it and one in which you can still get good marks. So in this case, instead of saying, right, this happened and this happened and this happened, this is why they were important, I've just taken the impact or the effect on Elizabethan England. So I've said one way the voyages of discovery changed Elizabethan England was that it helped make people very wealthy. And then I would go on to explain who and how and why. And then I've done another one about raising national pride. I've even done a third one there, which is about the beginnings of the British Empire. And that is a perfectly acceptable way to do this question, and probably a bit easier than tying yourself in knots over the chronology. Though if you can do that, fine. I would suggest, again, best answers will always give some sense of how significant this change was at the end. And you can see my little model does that. 2 or 3 changes, if you can, is the way to do that. Now, the last question I am not going to spend a lot of time on because this is the historic environment question and really requires a focus in and of itself, but it is the essay question, and you know that the site changes every year, and it'll ask you to consider what a site or an area, in this case it's the it's Hardwick Hall, but in 2024 as I'm doing this it's Drake's Voyages of Discovery, so it's the kind of Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and it's going to ask you to look at a factor that you have to talk about in the title, but you've also got to talk about other related factors. Now, I'm not going to go into this question because you really need to look at the specific area in order to get much detail out of it, but just bear in mind it's an essay question. You're looking to write about 2 to 3 different factors in relation to the question, and the best answers say how far the statement is true in relation to that conclusion. This question is all about motivation, location, function and purpose, but I won't talk more about that now because that really requires something separate. So this video is mainly focused on the first 3 questions. Thank you.